Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I'm here, uh, I'm here to talk about an issue that I came across on Instagram, thanks to my co-host Lisa. That she showed me a video of a girl saying that she said, "Where were the Asians and the Latinos during segregation in this country?" And she said it all came down to white versus black in this country in regards to segregation. And that is something that we, at least what's going on, that is something that we learn about as far as U.S. history. We learn about only whites and blacks, in segregation, white people and black people, right? But the first thing we need to understand is that whiteness, white people, is a social construct. It's not one ethnicity. It is many ethnicities in this country. And at various times in America's history, different groups have been included and different groups have been excluded from whiteness. For example, take the first example, the Irish. The Irish started to come to this country in about 18 in the 1840s after the Irish potato famine. Their British overlords poisoned the potato fields, and many Irish Catholics were forced to come to this country because of that. And when they came here, they were subject to discrimination laws based on both their ethnicity as well as their religion. Because the United States was set up as a British colony, with British laws and British prejudices, just like they had back in the UK. And one of the prejudices in the UK was anti-Catholicism, Catholic bias. So, with that being said, of course, America would be suspicious and exclude the Irish because of all the people in Western Europe, the Irish were the only ones that remained Catholic after the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. So when they come to America in the 1840s, there are signs above store windows, no Irish need apply. Now this is before official segregation was set in stone with regards to quote unquote blacks and whites. Why? Because this was the 1840s, and slavery didn't officially end until 1865. The next group, Italians. Italians start to come to the United States in the about the 1890s. Why? Because Italy before 1871 was divided into various uh, different counties. People say, oh, like with Columbus, they say, oh, Columbus was Italian. Technically, he was because he was from an Italian city state in Genoa, but there was no such country named Italy when he sailed in 1492. Italy was divided into separate sub-kingdoms, controlled some by the Pope, some by Spain, some by uh, the Muslims at one time, the Normans at different times. Italy was various different people. So, uh, in order to become unified, they had to go through various different wars. So, during these wars, people were pushed out from Italy to the United States. And when they came here, the ones that came here were Southern Italians, right? They were not Northern Italians. They were Southern Italians, meaning that over the course of several centuries, they had interactions with African people, particularly Moors. The Moors, the North African Moors, invaded and occupied Italy for 400 to 500 years, and most of the Moors were either mixed blood of sub-Saharan Africans, who they had as sub-Saharan Africans they had as mercenaries, or Arabs, or native North African Berbers. So they had a darker tinge to their skin than the average European, especially the average Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American. So they called them Guineas. Basically, the word Guinea was to indicate that they were of African descent. So they discriminated against the Italians. And in 1891, several Italians in New Orleans were actually lynched. There was a famous lynching against a lot of Italians in the city of New Orleans because of the prejudice against them. One, because they were Catholic, just like the Irish, and two, they were worse than the Irish because they didn't speak English and they were dark skinned. Now we get to Asians. The reason why this girl probably never knew about the exclusion of against Asians that took place, starting with the first Chinese Exclusion Act in 1892 by Chester Arthur, the same president who ended Reconstruction with regards to Black Americans. This president discriminated against Chinese because here's what was happening in in um in the west in the West Coast. She probably didn't know this because she's focusing entirely on the American South. Lisa says she was never taught it in school. Her narrative is focused entirely on the American South, and of course, the American South was primarily binary, primarily black and primarily black American and primarily white American. Not always though, because for a while after slavery ended, we talked about this in several other European countries. Several other European countries used Asian indentured labor. For example, the British brought East Indians to Trinidad and Guyana, and they brought other Asians like Chinese and the Brazilians. The Portuguese brought Japanese to Brazil. The Spanish brought Chinese to Cuba. So other European countries, after their slavery ended, they used Asian indentured labor. So American Southerners tried that too, but specifically in New Orleans and in Mississippi. And those Asian communities blended in seamlessly with the black communities where they were also subject to discrimination. But largely that wasn't the case. Largely Asian indentured labor and Asian discriminatory laws towards Asians occurred mostly in California. Um, California didn't really have a problem in terms of white and black because there weren't that many black people in California, during that time because California was a free state. It was not a slave state, so it wouldn't have had a large influx of the black population, but it would have had a large influx of Asians. Uh, oh, she didn't. Oh, she didn't bring up Asians. I thought she did. Hold on, Lisa. Let me look. Hold on. Oh yeah, no, no, you're right. You're right. So sorry, my mistake. My mistake. But let's talk about Asians though, because people people wonder about that too. So about Asians, they were subject to the same discriminatory laws as black people, but in a different part of the country. The laws that affected the Italians and the Irish, those were mostly in the Northeast. The ones that affected Black Americans were mostly in the Southeast, and the ones that affected Asians were mostly in the West Coast. Now let's talk about Let's talk about Hispanics. Now, Hispanics are a little bit of a tricky one because unlike black people and unlike Asians, a lot of Hispanics look and appear white because a lot of Hispanics have white ancestry due to colonization and intermixing with Spain, uh, over the centuries. So when the first Hispanics come into the country, as far as like after the Mexican American War, after 1848, Mexicans start to uh, come into the country by virtue of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the treaty that ended the Mexican American War. American politicians at the time were confused about how to classify Mexicans because they had these racial classifications, white, black, and Indian at this time, right? And Mexicans don't really fit into any of those categories. Some could look white, some could look black, some could look Indian, right? They were like, well, what are they? Mostly they're mixed. So ultimately, they settled on an official white categorization. But since we have sectionalism in this country and states and the different states get to decide their own fate, we talked about this a lot with regards to um, with regards to how laws, how difficult it is to pass certain laws because different states have different mediums. For example, one state will allow same-sex marriage and another state won't. One state will legalize marijuana and another state won't. Well, it's the same way with this kind of stuff. Although they were legally classed as white, they were not treated as white people in the states where they were in the majority, particularly in California and Texas, right? And New Mexico, because the white minority was scared of losing power, similar to the way it always is, right? So they were subject to discrimination laws. In fact, in 1954, right before the landmark case of Brown versus the Board of Ed, there was another case called Hernandez versus the state of Texas that desegregated schools with regards to Mexican Americans first before they desegregated schools with regards to black children. Likewise, in California, there was another case, Mendez versus Westminster, which had desegregated the schools and institutions in the state of California with regard to Hispanics and uh, and Mexicans. Now, other Hispanic ethnicities, of course, they were not subject to legal segregation because Puerto Ricans um, coming into this country into the country and settled in the Northeast. The Northeast, there was never official segregation. Um, Cubans came into this country, and Cubans came after segregation. They came after it was pretty much over, right? They came around after 1959 in the early 60s. So, of course, they were not subject to segregation. And plus, most of the Cubans who came into America during the initial exodus from Castro after he assumed power were Cubans of light skin and mostly European heritage. So they just blended in, right? So uh, that would not be, they would not be subject to it. Uh, as far as like leaders, there were desegregationist leaders that were of Hispanic descent. You had Cesar Chavez, you had Dolores Huerta, you had um, you had leaders of LULAC. But the difference was, the only thing was that these groups never joined in with the African American groups. They were inspired a lot of times, like Cesar Chavez, his famous Delano March, where he marched across California for Mexican farmer rights and immigrant rights. He never joined in with the black civil rights leaders most of the time, not all the time, because you did have examples. When you got into the late '60s, like the Brown Berets, that was established in 1960, 65, 66 by David Sanchez. And it was a group of Mexican Americans that were inspired by the Black Panthers, or a group of Puerto Rican Chicagoans in 1968. A former gang turned into a civil rights organization called the Young Lords, established by Jose Chacha Jimenez, and later spread to New York, the Puerto Rican communities in New York. So you did have some that joined in, but initially groups like LULAC, which was like a Latino version of the NAACP, they didn't want to join with the black struggle because they were classified as white. So why would they want to? Why would they feel like they would put their own risks on the line to ally with African Americans? It's sad, but it's the truth. You know what I mean? You didn't have a lot of solidarity uh, with the black struggle. Yeah, yeah, Lisa. Most of the time, yeah. Except in Texas and California. Only in Texas and California. In other states, no, they didn't. Hispanics don't have a real presence now in South Carolina, in Georgia, in Louisiana, in Mississippi, in Alabama, any of those states. Even now, Hispanics don't have a large presence now in those states that were subject to segregation. So no, of course not. Um, you don't you don't go to Alabama, you don't go to Selma, Alabama, or Biloxi, Mississippi, or Jackson, Mississippi, and think, yo, you know what I'm gonna get? Some bomb ass Mexican food, or some some bomb Puerto Rican food or Dominican food. Those, Hispanics don't live in those areas. They probably don't even. Most Hispanics don't even know those areas. Yes, in Texas, I said in Texas they were. Yes, Texas was subject to segregation. In Texas, they were subject to segregation. The sign on this thumbnail um, is from Texas. So in Texas, they were subject to segregation, and in California. But in California, there were almost no black people until much later. The black communities are younger than the Hispanic communities. Mexico, California is a Hispanic, state. So California didn't have Jim Crow with regards to black people, but uh, they had de facto segregation. I mean, there was racism in California, especially when a lot of black people started to come there after the 1920s and 30s with the Great Migration in places like Watts and South Central. That was true. Even Compton used to be a segregated neighborhood that was all white, right? But it wasn't. There weren't laws on the books against African Americans in the way there were against in California initially, in the way there were against Asians and Hispanics. Asians had three uh, exclusion acts passed against them: the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1907, the Gentleman's Agreement of 1924, the Gentleman's Agreement of 1924, and then a separate um, Asian Exclusion Act that was passed in the 1930s. I mean, the 1940s after Pearl Harbor, just regarding Japanese Americans in particular. So, yes, yeah. Lisa asked, like at the time, Hispanics told not to eat at places or anything like, yeah, black people. Yes, in Texas, yes. Texas and California, Lisa, yeah. And New Mexico, but not in Alabama, not in Mississippi, because they didn't exist there. They didn't exist there. Those are not. David says he's Romanian. Yeah, David, we knew that. Romanians, I'm not sure. David, I don't know the history of the Romanian American community. I know with regards to Armenians, there was questions. I know there's been discrimination with Romanians as far as in Europe, as far as like the Romani people. They've been discriminated against for generations. So, but in the United States, I'm not sure. You know, I think you guys are pretty new here in the States. Coming after the end of the Cold War. Like you said, your family came in the 80s. No, because Hispanic culture, Hispanic history is not taught here in the States like that, Lisa. Because it's just, I don't know, like teachers themselves don't really know much about it. It's assumed that most Hispanics are first generation Americans or second generation Americans and are new to this country. Even though, ironically enough, if you include Spaniards as Hispanic, um, Hispanic presence has been in this country since the 1500s. So that's probably why. That's probably why, Lisa. Yeah, well, I just brought up Cesar Chavez in this video. Yeah, most people weren't taught about him. A lot of people might know about him because there was an episode of him about him on Moesha. Because the the conflict in Moesha was on this episode was that the black students wanted a mural of like I think Martin Luther King, and the Hispanic students wanted a mural of Cesar Chavez. And his birthday's coming up, and Cesar Chavez Day is an official holiday. Um, in Texas, and I think in parts in California, March 31st is his day. And there's a movie about him that came out, I think, about 10, 11 years ago, maybe more, starring Michael Pena about his life. But when was the movie? Uh, Let me look it up. I have it in my library. I've watched it before, but I don't know when it came out. Let me look it up. Okay, wow. Yeah, I was right. 10 years ago came out. It was 2014. It was starring. It was directed by Diego Luna, the guy who played Cassian Andor in the Star Wars, and it was starring Michael Pena. It is about the 1975 Modesto March. Um, and that included not only Mexicans but also Filipino farm workers for Filipino. Oh, you eat Chinese food, David? Okay. I mean, that's cool. Chinese food is good. But you wouldn't have had that Chinese food if yeah, you lived in the 1890s because Chinese people weren't allowed uh, in the United States. And you might not have it soon anyway because of the current administration that is very xenophobic against Asians and other minorities. But yeah, this girl just doesn't know. You know what I mean? She's only taught one narrative in history. Now, you can't compare the experiences because although these other groups experienced segregation and they experienced discrimination at the hands of the dominant society, they did not. There's one thing that they did not experience that makes the African American experience much more unique, and that is chattel slavery. No other group experienced that in this country. That's the difference. But other than that, yeah, segregation many groups experience. Lisa says, do I think Hispanic history should be taught in school? Yeah, yes, obviously it should, especially in September, which is Hispanic Heritage Month. Um, Trump was president of the United States and didn't even know that Puerto Rico was a U.S. territory and that Puerto Ricans were citizens. During the Hurricane Maria debacle of 2018-17, yeah, chattel slavery, Lisa. It's a type of slavery that um, you inherit from birth. Like it's different. There's different types of slavery, and the type of slavery that existed here in the United States was chattel slavery. I'll read you the textbook definition of it. It's the enslaving and owning of human beings and their offspring through uh, through force. So, in other words, in most parts of the world, there have been slavery. People always bring this up in when they talk about reparations, specifically for foundational Black Americans. They always say, "Well, there's been slavery all over the world." Yes, that's true. Romans had slavery, Greeks had slaves, Egyptians, every group, right? But the difference was that you could be emancipated uh, when you were a slave in other parts of the world and other different times in history. Your status as a slave wasn't determined by your birth. Your status as a slave was determined for other things, particularly if you owed a debt or you committed a specific crime or your nation or group was conquered in war by another nation or group, right? Or sometimes in the case of the Ottomans, in the Janissary Corps, which was their military-based slavery, they Christian families, and this applies to Romania. David would know this probably. Um, Christians, when they were under Muslim rule in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, they would sometimes give their children to the Ottomans to raise because they would get better education, they would get better treatment, right? So, but their condition wasn't permanent. The difference with this type of slavery that existed here in the States was that their condition was permanent. They were slaves since the day they were born, and they were slaves since the day they died, and they could be sold at will, you know? And even when they weren't slaves, the condition of their skin color, as determined by the 1857 Dred Scott decision, made sure that even in non slave states, slaves could still be captured and brought back to their specific masters. So that was a condition that only existed to African Americans and no other group. So that's why reparations should go to African Americans and no other group. But as far as segregation, there was segregation against a lot of other groups in this country. There's some that are considered white today, and others that are considered non-white today. Yeah, Lisa says, "Oh wow, I never knew that term. I never knew it either, Lisa, until I learned it in college in my African American Studies course." Thank you, Kingsborough Community College teacher. He was a Ghanaian, and of course, the first thing we talked about was slavery. you know, you know what I mean, because it's an African American history course. But yeah, that's the term. That's the difference. So you can't compare it to any other form of slavery. When anybody tells you, "Oh, well, there was always slaves," Africans had slaves. Yeah, but there was differences between the way the Africans enslaved people and the way the Muslims enslaved people versus what existed here in the United States. This was a race-based slavery. Those weren't race-based slavery. They had in the Muslim world, they had black slaves, they had white slaves. They had Arab slaves, they had Persian slaves, they had all kinds of slaves. You, you know what I mean? And you could you could be born a slave and die a free person. You could do that here in the United States, but it was very rare. Most of the time, and your owner had to decide to let you free. You couldn't earn your freedom in any sort of way. Your condition was determined since birth. We were the first society to create a society of race-based slavery. So that had never existed in human history up to that point. You know, only in America was that ever a thing. I mean, the other types of slavery, they can't compare that to what went on here. It was different. It was totally different. So yeah, these other groups like the Irish people, that's another one people use. Oh, the Irish, they were slaves too, right? You know what I mean? They were the first slaves. There were groups of Irish indentured laborers, mostly Irish Protestants, because again, Ireland is divided between the northern section of Ireland, which is predominantly Protestant Christian, and the southern section of Ireland, which is predominantly Catholic. So Irish Protestants, which are called usually is called they're called the Scots Irish, right? They were used as indentured laborers to come over here to America, right, and other places too, like the West Indies. They got a group in Barbados called the Redlegs, which are white Bajans, white people of Barbadian descent that you know of Irish descent, Scotch Irish descent, but they were indentured laborers. When they worked for a period of time, say 7 years, 10 years, and then they would be set free. That wasn't the case for the black people that were brought over to Barbados or the United States. You know what I mean? So it was totally different. You can't compare the two. They do this to try to minimize the brutality that existed in American slavery. American slavery was unique. It was race based. You know, And when I say American, I'm not just talking about the United States. I'm talking about the entire continent of America, which includes Hispanic countries, West Indian countries, French colonies like Haiti and Guadeloupe, and also, excuse me, also the Dutch realms like Suriname and the ABC Islands. I'm including those, but that's America too. Because remember, the United States is the United States of America. So it's a country of United States in America. So America, obviously, the name implies that America is bigger than those 50 states. So the entire continent of both Americas, North and South, um, had slavery, with the exception of Canada. Canada really didn't because it wasn't hospitable, because Canada is super cold. So slavery wasn't hospitable to the kind of slavery, the plantation based slavery that was in the United States or in the Caribbean, wasn't hospitable to Canada. So they really didn't have it. But the other places did, including Mexico. Mexico had slaves, and you know, there were Africans imported into Mexico. The reason why you don't see a large percentage of visibly black people in Mexico, people that look black, people that appear black, is because there was higher rates of miscegenation. And because the slavery there was so brutal that a lot of the people died. It's not a laugh at, but that's just a nervous tick of mine that I do. Sorry, but a lot of people died during that period. In Latin America, Latin American slavery was way more brutal in some ways than in the United States, and in some ways not, because after slavery in Latin America, when slavery ended in Latin America, the people, the Africans and the non-Africans, particularly the whites and the natives, Native Americans, they blended in to create a new mix, right? But they didn't do that in the United States in large portions. Segregation kicked in, so that's how it's different, and that's why Latinos look different than their North American counterparts. They look more like people of color because of that reason. And their traditions are a blend of indigenous, Native American, African, and European. So just a different approach to things. That's all. But of course, Latinos deny they have African ancestry. This is why, and this is bringing it up to the current. I don't know what that girl's motivation was in making that video. Maybe she was just historically curious or whatever. But this is why a lot of black people don't feel sympathy. A lot of black Americans that I know, that I speak to, a lot of them don't feel sympathy for what the Mexicans and other Latinos are going through, because never in history have any of these groups fought side by side with black people. You know, yeah, there weren't large portions of Mexicans or other Latinos in Selma or any place where black people marched, right? But they could have went down there. Many white people from the north went down there. Jewish people marched with Martin Luther King Jr., right? Helped Martin Luther King Jr. Hispanics did not do that. You know what I mean? LULAC, like I said, the Hispanic Civil Rights Organization, they declared that their fight is not the same fight as black people, and they didn't want they didn't want to catch strays. In other words, they didn't want to be involved, in a large part, because they were fighting against the system to be included as white, not to be included as equals on their own merit. They wanted to be, they're like, hey, well, we're white constitutionally according to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So why aren't we afforded the same rights as other white people, quote unquote? We consider white legally by law, so shouldn't we be included in that? And to this day, to the modern day, as Deontay Wilder, the boxer, says, to this day, that mean to this day, uh, the modern day stuff like Floyd and Breonna Taylor. How many Hispanics and not just Hispanic individuals, because I'm sure there are many, right? But how many Hispanic organizations, La Raza, LULAC, which still exist, um, and other Hispanic groups are involved with BLM or involved with any black group? None, zero. They, you never hear, even the rappers, Fat Joe, you never hear him come out in support of BLM, right? You never hear him come out in support of any black causes, ever, right? People say, well, he's not black, but black people are not Hispanic. But black people support Hispanic causes. They're against what Trump is doing to to Hispanics, deporting them. It has nothing to do with them because black people are exempt from deportation. They can't be deported because they're American citizens by virtue of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution after the Civil War. That has nothing to do with black people. The black people could just sit back and say, you know what, I don't care. You know what I mean? I don't care what goes on with these mass deportations. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't hinder my life in any way. But they don't do that. All the black politicians, the National Black Caucus in Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett, the entire squad, Ilhan Omar, all the Ayanna Presley, they all come out in support of against what Trump is doing to speak out. In fact, their voices are louder than a lot of the Hispanic voices that it directly affects, right? But in reality, a lot of these Hispanics should say, black leaders rather should say, you know what? This is what you get because remember, what was the group that tipped the scales in favor of Trump in 2024? Right, Al Sharpton, Lisa's right, another one. It was Hispanics. Hispanics voted him in. Hispanics. So you get what you asked for. You voted for the man. He's in. You thought he was bullshitting. He kept his campaign promise. His campaign promise was mass deportations on day one. When he got in, day one, we saw mass deportations. Trump made history. He became the first politician ever, Republican or Democrat, to say he was going to do something and actually do it. The first politician in history to say he was going to do something and actually get it done and actually do it. Republican or Democrat. It was a bad thing. It was horrible, but he said he was going to do it and he did it. And you thought he was bullshitting. The guy said on day one, when I get in office, I will deport. I will start mass deportations. And all the Hispanics sat back and said, oh, he's probably just saying that. No, he wasn't just saying it. He meant it. So far, his performance in 2024, if this is what if you voted for him and this is the stuff you want and you're his base and you wanted mass deportation, you wanted an end to DI, you wanted a pullout of Ukraine, you wanted tougher measures in Gaza for to favor the Israelis. If you wanted all that stuff, Trump gave it to you. Trump has given his people, the people that voted him for those things, he's given them everything they want. Except lower egg prices, which he could never do anyway. But Everything else he's given to them. He's the only politician that I've known that has delivered 100% or at least 50, 60% of what he said he was going to do. You know, you could call him destructive, you could call him a dictator, but you cannot call him a liar. He's done it. You know, and as far as it pertains to Hispanics, he said on day one, I'm going to mass deport, and on day one he mass deported. You know, he was, and then people are looking around at their friends going, "Well, I didn't know he really. I thought he was just playing." You know, no, he wasn't playing. He was for real. You know, the leopard has eaten your face. You've got what you deserved. You know, it's a classic example of watch what you wish for because you just might get it. And they should have watched what they wished for when it came to Trump because they didn't just get a little bit of it; they got a lot of it. And and people have come out, Hispanics have come out and said, "Where's the black community? Where's the black community?" About about Al Sharpton, Lisa? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, Al Sharpton. He's been supporting Hispanics for uh, decades. But again, if it were mutual support, that'd be cool. But it's not. It's one. The support is one sided. You know what I mean? Uh, Most Hispanics both. No, I didn't get that. It just says Al Sharpton, and then it says, "Jay, read my previous message," and then I don't see anything else about. Do I think it should be taught in schools? Yeah, I answered that. Always. I think it should, but it's up to them. It's up to Hispanic activists to push for things like this. Black people have been struggling for years to push for things like this. They didn't just get it overnight. They struggled for it. But the problem is most Hispanics want to be included in the European majority and will go along with what white conservatives say. You saw it when they voted for Trump. They don't want to push for their own identity. If anything, they want to blend in as much as possible. Right? So if you start teaching that Hispanics were subject to segregation too, they might get offended because that would mean that they're different in a way than the majority white Americans, and they don't want to be different than the majority white Americans. They want to be like the majority white Americans. They want to be accepted as the majority white Americans. Hispanics are of mixed race, mixed origins, most of us, but we value our European heritage more than we value our African or indigenous heritage. In order to learn to value our African and indigenous heritages, most Hispanic people have to be taught that even is a part of their ancestry and have to be deprogrammed to value those other non-white European ancestries. The European colonizer, the Spanish colonizer, was very successful in getting us to identify with him or her and identify with our oppressor. For most of us, we have colonized minds, so most of us wouldn't want something like this to be taught in schools. Our goal, most of the Latin American activists, the goal was to assimilate into whiteness. That's why they were offended that they were subject to segregation, not because, oh, we want to be treated as equals as Hispanics. No, we want to be treated as equals as other white people because they saw themselves as white, but the Lord didn't see them as white. You know what I mean? Like, hey, why aren't we included? We're white too, right? But not by American standards. No, you know, you know, it was a different fight. African Americans and Asians, they can't be included as white because they look different. You know, they don't have European origins. They don't have partial European origins. So some African Americans do, but most don't. You know what I mean? But so African Americans and Asians, whatever little bit of Asians there were in various places, you know, they were fighting to be considered as equal as Americans. They weren't being fighting to be considered equal as white people, right? So in other words, the Hispanics were saying, "Oh, we don't care that you discriminate against black people or Asians, as long as you don't discriminate against us. As long as we're accepted and we're allowed to go to the party, we don't care who else you exclude. Matter of fact, exclude those other people because we don't like them either." You know, that was the attitude that the Hispanic activists were taking. Most of them, at that time. Uh, it was the black activists that wanted to bring in the Hispanics. It wasn't the other way around. Anyway, guys, that's all for today. Thank you, Lisa and David, for contributing. Uh, love you guys. This was a very interesting topic. Um, love to do these kind of history videos. I just finished, of course, my series, my Road to WrestleMania series. I would love to do a series on history next, something else, that relates to history because I love this kind of stuff. Peace, guys.